I want to open this up, and I want to open up for the full dais to be able to talk about questions, to be able to interact. But I want to give you a broad philosophical question that you're going to think I'm kidding, but I'm not. Independent of who? They're an independent agency. Independent of who?
I'll give the answer. I think it's not independent of who, but independent for what? To exercise independent judgment, and I think the key word there is judgment, and I think the key thought is in Adam's testimony. They were originally thought of as kind of specialized courts, not as specialized legislatures. And I think unless you go back to that model of more an independent court with more circumscribed jurisdiction, I think you're going to have problems.
I asked that question because the common question here is we can't impose 12866 on them. We can't put them in UMRA. We can't put them in all these things because they're independent of the executive agencies and independent of Congress. And it's always they're independent of who. I think we've lost the why that they were created because they were supposed to be non-political, supposed to give faster judgments with greater expertise than what the federal courts could do or other entities that were going to be specialized in their area to be able to give faster, non-political responses. And now we have independents like the FCC, where it's really this five-member board that 3 members are selected by the president's party and by the president. And so they're not non-political, they're not faster, they're not cheaper. And so we're back to the same issue. We still have these independent entities that Congress seems to argue about who are they independent from, and we've lost the why that they ever existed as an independent. And I think the argument really boils down to a philosophical argument of if we're going to determine what to do with the agencies that are creating billions of dollars in regulatory schemes and giving answers to people based on statutes that we're at a loss to figure out where it connected to actually statute, then we've got to figure out if they're really independent. Independent of who? Is it independent of Congress, independent of the executive branch, independent of the judicial branch, independent of the American people? Who are they independent of? And then how are they going to actually be formed? I know that may be a bigger philosophical argument, but we've not resolved that basic question, quite frankly, as a Congress. And if we can ever resolve that issue, I think it's going to go to the next step. Do we need agents to have that are independent agencies anymore? And if we do, how do we reform them? Because they're not functioning as apolitical bodies anymore. They very much seem to have a political agenda, and their timing and their cost seems to be equated to other federal benches. Mr. White.
I mean, I agree with all that, and if I may add a further point, as I said earlier, I think the trend line is in the wrong direction with respect to independence from Congress. Independence from the President raises a whole host of questions in and of itself, but independence from Congress shouldn't be a question at all. These agencies should be accountable. But in recent years, from Sarbanes-Oxley to the Affordable Care Act to Dodd-Frank, the move has been to make these agencies structurally independent from Congress, and that's very dangerous. And not just for these particular agencies, but going forward. The New Deal era agencies and the ones before, from the FTC, the FCC, and so on, they basically set the paradigm for the next 60 years or more. That defined what the benchmark for independent agencies would be. And if Congress doesn't take steps to correct the structural mistakes that it made, with all due respect, in the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, the Affordable Care Act, and Dodd-Frank, making these agencies even more independent, that will become the paradigm for independent agencies going forward. The next independent agencies won't be modeled on the FTC. They'll be modeled on, for example, the CFPB. I think that's very dangerous.
And the CFPB, as of now in Oklahoma, 24% of our commercial banks no longer do home mortgages, strictly based on the issues that Consumer Financial Protection Bureau created these set of regulations. There's so much liability now, they walked away from doing mortgages. 24% of our banks in Oklahoma. It is becoming more and more difficult, especially in rural areas of my state, to be able to get a home loan because the banks have walked away from doing that because people have seasonal income, because their income doesn't come in every month in a predictable format that CFPB wants. It comes in when the crops come in or when there's a sale. So that's seasonal income, not consistent, too much risk. Those are things that should have been determined in a cost-benefit analysis that should have oversight, and CFPB, as we all know extremely well, has no oversight. So I'm back to the same issue. How do we get to a set of independence that there's a sense that they're not independent of the American people, Congress created them. They're not independent of Congress's oversight by far. If Congress created them, Congress can turn it off as well. But there has to be some level of oversight. All of us have oversight, and there's an entity that has no oversight. That's more independent than our Constitution ever conceived of in any mindset. So let me just, does anyone make a quick comment on that?
If I could you've asked a great question, and one of the reasons it's challenging, just to pick up on your last point about the Constitution, it really speaks to the independence from factions. If we go back to Madison, really, is what we're, both factional influences through political branches of government and through influence by private interests through, say, regulatory capture. Both of those are the type of independence that are reflected in the concern that motivates independence for agencies. I think that the formal structures are not always fully aligned with actual independence. It was mentioned before about, I think, Chairman Lankford, you mentioned the comments by a president reflecting a policy preference for what the FCC might take, and the FCC then pursuing that. There are opportunities for influence. I agree, Senator Portman, for influence by members of either Article I institutions or Article II institutions to influence independent agencies. And there's also some executive branch agencies that operate with a great deal of actual practical autonomy. I think ultimately it's a challenging question because we're looking for something where there is at least independence on factual determinations, expert judgment. We want that to be pure and based on sound scientific assessments. We don't want that to be influenced by, but on the other hand, we are a democracy, and value choices, the fundamental values that are reflected in policy choices that independent agencies make, should indeed reflect those of the Congress and the elected officials.
Should we assume that executive agencies then won't have bipartisan or won't have non-political answers that are based on sound science, that only independents can do that?
No, I think that's not. I mean, the Food and Drug Administration has historically had a very strong reputation for operational independence on making those kinds of scientific judgments.
So I'm back to the same issue then. At where we have evolved at this point in the structure of independent agencies and what has happened, whether it be Mr. White and all of your very good analysis just on the history and what happened in the Reagan administration and opting out from OIRA at that time and some of the decisions that have been made and then the acceleration since then. Is there a reason that we should have independent agencies separate from executive agencies, that they have two different structures, two different operations? Because as all three of you noted in your written testimony, it's tough to get even a definition of what an independent agency is. I mean, there's the 19 that are listed, but operationally it's, can the president fire the head of it without cause, just fire the head of it? And are they under OIRA review, are the basics of it? But even that has some breakdown in some of the agencies that are called independents. So the issue is at this point, why do we have some entities now under current operation that are called independent and some are called executive and have two sets of rules on them when they're all processing the same regulations? Mr. White.
Well, while we're talking now about rulemaking, it's important to keep in mind that independent agencies do a lot of adjudication, right? The FTC and some of the other agencies do a lot of case-by-case adjudication. That really was in the core function of independent agencies at their origin. And I do think some measure of independence, a limited measure of independence, is important for those functions. And another word...
But independent from who at that point?
Right, again, at that point, it's independent from direct controlling decision by the president, or at least insulation from it. And I'm not saying that the president is constitutionally barred from getting involved in that. I'm just saying I understand why that's a specific subset of agency action that might justify some measure.
Because it's more judicial.
It's more judicial. As they used to say, it's quasi-judicial, right. Which was the whole justification for their independence in the Humphreys Executor case that recognized agency independence. And I will say with the independent commissions, when you have a multi-member structure, that does help build in an internal check and balance, right? At the very least, when the FCC makes a decision, you might have two dissenting commissioners who, like judges on a court, are going to have dissenting opinions and in some limited ways force a dialogue within the agency. I think that's a very important and very good aspect of independent regulatory commissions, that they have that multi-member body. And so that's a useful function, especially in that quasi-judicial context.
So how are they functioning different than administrative law judge, which is also quasi-judicial, but they're in executive agencies?
Well, that's a very fair point. I'd say it's in the independent agencies, it's like the difference between a court of appeals and a district court judge. An ALJ makes an independent decision, and then it goes on to the multi-member head. But you're right, in the executive agencies, that's a very good question why that should go directly to an executive branch official.
Other thoughts?
I'll just say that I think you're hitting the nail right on the head, and I think these are very, very complicated and critical issues, and I don't have a blithe answer to them other than just to say that I do worry about giving too much in legislation and trying to extend this, because if you extend it only in a way that preserves too much independence, you're in a sense sending a signal that they really are independent.
Yeah, and that is really the concern for me, is that we're creating more and more a sense that they really are truly independent of everyone. And with no accountability, we have a big issue. We get to CFPB that their funding doesn't connect to Congress, their oversight's not here, there's no oversight in the presidency, no board even to be able to get a check, a single member that's a leader. You really have created a fourth branch of government in some ways that has very little to no restrictions around them. And even if they want to reinterpret some of their own originating statute, they have the opportunity to be able to do that. And that's a big concern for me. One quick question, let me open this up for broader conversation because I don't want to hog all the conversation. Does any of the three of you have an issue with codifying 12866 for both executive entities and for independent entities? That would move from being an executive order to being codified?
No, I don't, and I would welcome it.
Okay. All right. Let me open this up. I don't want to hog the time because I know several of those that may have questions and thoughts.